So welcome to this Old Plan, Preserving Alberta's History Through Land Use Planning. My name is Rachel DeVos, and I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy at the AUMA. I'll start by providing a bit of context on AUMA's Land Use Planning webinar series and the connection between the land use framework and historic resources. I'll then turn things over to Anna Curtis, Head of Land Use Planning for the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture and Tourism. Anna will provide an overview of the regulatory obligations of municipalities under the Historical Resources Act and how these responsibilities are defined under the land use framework and within existing regional plans. As I said, we'll have time for questions before wrapping things up with information on upcoming webinars. So today's webinar is part of AUMA's Land Use Planning series, which provides the opportunity for participants to learn more about and discuss the land use framework and related strategies. The series kicked off on September 30th with pulling in the same direction, aligning land use planning making, or land use decision making. During the webinar, staff from Municipal Affairs and the Land Use Secretariat provided an update on the status of regional plans under the framework, the requirement for municipal compliance with these plans, and an overview of the efficient use of land principles. And I know many of you participated in this webinar or have watched a recording of it. And if you didn't get the opportunity to, I'm just copying and pasting a link to a video of the recording into the chat box. So based on a request from members, we chose historic resources as the topic of our next webinars in the series. Historic resources may not be the first topic that comes to mind when one thinks of land use planning, as issues such as urban sprawl, energy development, and conservation of natural areas tend to get more attention. However, the management of historic resources is an important part of achieving the outcomes set out in the land use framework, namely a healthy economy supported by our land and natural resources, healthy ecosystems and environment, and people-friendly communities with ample recreational and cultural opportunities. Under this last outcome, the framework sets out that significant historic resources will be identified and protected, and potential impacts are managed effectively. Of course, the land use framework is being implemented through regional planning. Under the heading of Building Sustainable Communities in the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, or SSRP, there's an objective to ensure provincial guidance is provided to municipalities and stakeholders to foster preservation of historic resources through responsible land use management. The plan also sets out expectations of municipalities, which will be discussed later. It was actually during a webinar we held last year on the SSRP that participants expressed the desire to have a follow-up webinar on historic resources. I think all of you on this webinar appreciate the importance of historic resources in creating a sense of place and pride for the residents of our communities. They add to the visual appeal, offer leisure opportunities, and with that contribute to municipalities' economic development and tourism potential. However, without careful consideration, planning, and investments, as our municipalities grow and modernize, these precious resources can be lost. Today's webinar is the first in a two-part series within a series looking at planning and historic resources. This webinar will focus on the regulatory aspect of the management of historic resources, while the second webinar on November 25th will focus on tools available to help municipalities identify and designate important local heritage. It will also feature the experience of the City of Lacombe with their award-winning heritage programs, and I'll tell you more about this before we wrap up today. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Anna Curtis, Head of Land Use Planning for the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture and Tourism. The Land Use Planning section coordinates and evaluates land-based development proposals that have the potential to impact historic resources. Land use planners work closely with federal, provincial, and municipal authorities and with industry representatives to ensure timely review of a vast array of development types in the province of Alberta. Anna brings a strong background in historic resource management to her position. She has a degree in archaeology. She's worked at the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology and was employed with the Government of Canada for many years in Aboriginal relations and consultation. Anna has worked in many places within Canada and around the world, including archaeological fieldwork in Belize on a post-classic Maya site from approximately 1400 AD, in eastern high Arctic on pre-Dorset sites from approximately 700 BC, paleontological fieldwork in northeast British Columbia looking for Triassic fish from about 225 million years ago, and excavation of a Brachylophosaurus. Sorry, I'm really testing my hooked on phonics here, from 76 million years ago in the Many Berries 1-4 region and in Japan as a living exhibit preparing a Tyrannosaurus rex skull from approximately 67 million years ago within an exhibition in Tokyo. And after that tongue twister, I'll turn things over to Anna.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for attending. And I really appreciate, Rachel, that you've invited me and the AUMA for the opportunity to work with municipalities and the planners out there. I'm going to talk today about the regulatory aspects of things. Now, I know that a lot of you are going to be really interested in talking about your specific heritage resources and specific heritage buildings or historic buildings within your communities and what to do with those. That is going to be in the second part of this series, and so there will be another person to address that. So as I explained to Rachel, the part that I'm going to talk about is really specific to the regulatory, the act, the legislation, a bit dry, but I'm going to try and make it interesting, about how to, how municipalities interact in that particular context, both as developers and as authorizing bodies. And then the second webinar is really going to focus in on those sort of more voluntary types of things and the tools that are available to help you as communities identify and protect those resources. So if you're okay with that, let's begin. So we're going to preserve the past for the future. That's our goal. That's what we're really hoping for. We see that there's a really strong need to continue to try and ground ourselves as communities, as a province, and as a nation in who we are by also looking at all the things that have gone on before us within this country. So the Historical Resources Act was enacted in 1973, and it governs the protection, development, study, and appreciation of historic resources. It is one of the strongest pieces of legislation in the province. It applies to both public and private lands. We're gonna leave the federal lands out of it for now. I mean, we do some work with federal lands, but let's just talk about. So I think that that's a really important thing because so many pieces of legislation in the province pertain specifically to Crown lands. This does not. This covers both of those things, both of those areas. So what are historic resources? And this is a big, something that maybe I take for granted, but I think really needed to be put in here. So it's any work of nature of humans, primarily of value for its paleontological, archaeological, prehistoric, historic, cultural, natural, scientific. Well, you can read that and see that it is in there, what you're looking at. And I'll just explain some of these pictures. And like I said, I'm trying to make the regulatory dry world a little more interesting by throwing a few pictures in. So what you're looking at is the jawbone of a giant sloth. It's quaternary, so it's Ice Age mammal. Just to, bump it up a little bit. So those are the kinds of things. Primarily what we do is we look at archaeology, paleontology, historic, and Aboriginal traditional use sites, and we'll get into that. So here we've got them listed out: prehistoric archaeological sites, historic archaeological sites, right? So we're talking about contact and pre-contact. historic structures and features, paleontological sites, traditional use sites, and natural sites. So things like the Big Rock out at Okotoks are covered under our Act because there's not really a place to put those otherwise. You're looking at, let me see, an ankylosaur. You're looking at some bone bed there out out at the Hardesty area, the Big Rock. So you're seeing a few things on that page there, just to give some examples. Now, how many? What are the recorded sites? These are very approximate numbers, but we're looking at 100,000 recorded historic sites in Alberta, 40,000 known archaeological sites in this province, 10,000 known paleontological locales, and over 1,000 identified traditional use sites. That's a lot. That's not all that we know, but that is a lot to consider. So now we get into the dry part. What is the scope of authority? I think the most pertinent part of the Act for the purposes of this talk really lie in Section 37 of the Act. And it says that if development activity is likely to disturb historic resources, the things that we just talked about, then the minister can require the developer, no matter who that is, to undertake a historic resources impact assessment to determine what impacts are expected to occur. So the developer, that can be even other provincial bodies. So we can require Alberta Transportation to do work. I mean, it's all, parks, we work closely with them. So we work across all development types. So in any given day, what may cross our desks in land use planning can be anything from a trail to a gravel pit to an oil sands operation. So we see the bulk of what goes on in the province. One of the things that I didn't put on this slide, but is also very important to note, is that for the purposes of the Act, all paleontological and archaeological resources in this province belong to the government of Alberta. So that doesn't mean the historic structures, okay, and that doesn't mean the Aboriginal traditional use sites. But when you're talking archaeology and paleontology, those resources are vested in the Crown and right of Alberta. So that's why, when it comes down to it, this is really important to take a look at. So when the minister thinks, oh, gee, how does that, this particular development is going to potentially impact a historic resource. Now, we'll get into that, how that determination is made a little bit further on. So there can be a request then for an assessment. So the assessment is generally, to start out with, a bit broader, and then we can actually require that there be a report submitted, and then we can take a look. Sorry, I just saw the question that says that does include ammonite sites. Absolutely, we'll talk about that as we go along. Or undertake any salvage or preservative things. I think of specific interest under Section 37 is this slide right here for the municipalities, okay? So, notwithstanding anything in any other act, when our minister makes an order under subsection 2, which is the impact assessments and mitigation and all that kind of thing, the minister may also require any municipality or other authority in Alberta, the issuance whose license, permit, consent, authorization, to basically hold off on that until the Minister of Alberta Culture and Tourism is satisfied that the Historic Resource Impact Assessment has been completed and has given approval. I think this is a really important slide and an important piece of that Act that municipalities should be aware of, okay? We're trying to work very closely with all of you on how that, we've not really we're not heavy-handed with it at all, but it's just about thinking about how does that, when you're authorizing developments within your area of authority, bear that in mind. All right, so what's our regulatory approach? So the Historic Resources Management branch, we act as sort of the referral window. So we've got essentially 4 areas of expertise. We've got archaeology, Aboriginal heritage, historic places, and paleontology. So when you see Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, Royal Alberta Museum, the Royal Alberta Museum handles Quaternary or Ice Age. Anything before the Ice Age is handled by the Tyrrell Museum. Historic Places Stewardship handles historic structures. Aboriginal heritage. So you may be asking yourself, well, doesn't the Aboriginal Consultation Office handle things like consultation and the discussion of what Aboriginal traditional use are? There are specific types of historic resources that may be considered, or Aboriginal traditional use sites that may be considered historic resources. So those kinds of sites would be things like burials, ceremonial sites, specific types of cabins. Sometimes they can be trails, they can be wiki-ups. So I think the key to remember with these ones is they are not the broader Aboriginal consultation kinds of things like hunting, fishing, trapping. We don't do that. Ours are very place and time specific. So like I say, a grave site, you know, we can pinpoint where that is, and if it's of concern to First Nations, we will record that and help work with them on that. And archaeology, of course, in that particular thing. So those are the areas of expertise. So what are our regulatory triggers? Right, so the listing of historic resources, Alberta Energy Regulator, environmental impact assessments. We put out industry-specific bulletins, and I'm going to talk about that because we have a subdivision bulletin that I think you'd all be interested to take a look at. We have a forestry program, the Alberta Utilities Commission. We have informal agreements with municipalities, government ministries, etc. And of course, the land use framework, the regional plans. We're going to talk about that too. So those are just some of our regulatory triggers. So what is the listing? Now the most, and many of you may be familiar with the listing of historic resources. It is one of the primary tools, but not the exclusive tool that we use, but one of the primary tools that we use in order to kind of take a look at developments. So it's based on analysis, it's at an LSD level. It's a trigger for certain small scale projects. And you'll see with certain types of, within our bulletins, we may say if you're under this size, you can solely use the listing based on these sorts of things. So what is the listing? We've assigned for all of these known sites, remember we talked about all the known sites right at the beginning, 100,000 historic sites, that kind of thing. We've assigned them a number, 1 to 4. Those are the known ones, the 1 to 4s. And so, you know, we say, okay, so a 1 is obviously a provincially designated historic resource. So that's a very big deal, and usually no development is allowed within those areas. A 2 will be a municipally designated. So you as municipalities will have locally important resources that you've designated municipally, and we put a 2 on those and say, okay, you know, we'll work with you on those ones. 3 is highly significant, and usually the 3s are sites that we are looking at either a provincial or a municipal designation on. 4 is, it's a known site, mostly, you know, avoidance or the conduct of additional studies. So if a project, let's say a pipeline, they can choose to go around, or they may mitigate that site, and we're okay with that. Then there's a category 5, and a category 5 means it's a high potential. So in other words, those are areas where we know that there may be a good potential. So for instance, with paleontology, we may know that there are good exposures of bedrock in a particular area, or good exposures of quaternary deposits in a particular area. We don't know for sure that there's a site. There may not have been anything found there, but we know that given those exposures, the possibility is high. Same thing with archaeology. And I'm going to give you an example that I've used quite a few times. I had a guy call me up, and he was quite upset because he's doing an RV park somewhere in the province. We'll just leave it at that. And he was mad because he said, you know, why did he have to do this study for historic resources for archaeology? He didn't understand. And I said, you know, explained to him the regulatory process. And he said, but how do you even know that there's anything there? And I said, well, let me ask you a question. I said, why are you putting an RV park in this place? And he went on. He waxed poetic about it was right by the river, there was really good fishing, you could see forever, it was just, you know, all of these things. And I said, well, do you think you're the first person to think of that? As human beings, in terms of archaeology, our needs and desires and wants are really not that different than the people's needs, desires, and wants from 5,000 years ago. You need to be near water, you need to be near food, you want to be able to see those sorts of things. So bear that in mind, and you know, it's not the sole thing, but it's one of the ways that we take a look at these high potential areas, right? We factor in a lot of things. So we have those. So we have then the historic resource category, so you'll see that just here. So A means archaeology, C means cultural, which is Aboriginal traditional use, H is historic, N is natural, P is paleontology. So we take a look. So when you are going to do a project, you can look up the listing of historic resources. We have a website that has that. It's either in an Excel format, which is kind of hard to read, or GIF. If you have, you can just download it. Now we update the listing twice a year, in March and in September. We update that listing. We add resources that have been, you know, newly found. We may change the number of the resource depending. So we can have an HRV 0 as well, which means that it used to be, let's say, a 4, and we allowed that site to be mitigated completely for development. The reason that we keep that on there, A, is so that we knew where those things were, but B, we can also take a look at that and say, hey, you know, if we had a site here and the development's coming very nearby, the likelihood is, because people traveled in groups and that kind of thing, the site may extend out a little bit. So that's what the listing is. So, sorry.
Anna, I just noticed we have a couple questions that are about the specific topic you're on now. So the first one is from Alice from the County of Newell. If a developer is applying for a permit to excavate ammonites, should they be sent to you for approval?
Yeah, the thing is that the ammonites is kind of a, it falls under two categories. And for those of you down in that, oh, Newell, yes, of course, down in that area and in those, and in the area where those ammonites are found, there's a specific sort of area down in southern Alberta where ammonites, which are a paleontological resource, have through processes of time and pressure and heat become a gem form. Right, so that's called ammonite, if any of you have seen the ammonite jewelry. So in order to manage that, because you know, ammonite, like the ammonite-oriented ammonites, have very little in the way of scientific value left to them. So there is a specific regulation under the Mines and Minerals Act that requires people to go through and get, you know, licenses and that kind of thing. If you're getting a permit to excavate ammonites, it is best, I think, to ask the proponent, whoever it is, if they've received their exemption and they have their license from Alberta Energy to go ahead. So those are important. They can't just come to the, like with any mineral disposition, they need to have all the authorities in place to do that. They can't just randomly start excavating for ammonites. Ammonites, those are mineral agreements, and people need to apply for those, so it's really important. I think most people that want to go into the ammonite business, the ammonite business, are fairly familiar, but as a municipality, I think, or as an authorizing body, you should probably ask to see those things. And then underneath that, there's another question: at what point does an HRV 5 move to another classification? Significance in signing a site a number. I have not been. Okay, so an HRV 5 is a high potential area. If there is a development going to go on, or for whatever reason we're out there and we will move it to a 4 if there's actually, we can actually identify a site. So in the case of archaeology, let's just use an example that's fairly familiar to a lot of people, teepee rings. We may not know, because we've not obviously walked over the entire province, but we can have a fairly good idea that there's a high ridge, it's near the river. We may put a 5 on that to say that's really high potential lands. If someone is going over that land for the purposes of an HRIA and they find a teepee ring, we will convert that then to a 4, because it stops being high potential, it becomes a known site. We've actually seen it, it's been documented and mapped. So that's what the significance of assigning a site a number is. So 1 being the most, the designated sites, like I say, 2 being municipally designated, 3 being very important sites. So you won't find very many 1s, 2s, or 3s within the listing. Mostly what you're going to find are 4s. So unless there is some reason, so we can move a 4 to a 3 if a site is known. And here's the thing, and especially with archaeology. Most people think that archaeologists are desperate to get out there and dig up absolutely everything. That's not really the case. We actually prefer to leave things in the ground if at all possible, because like with any other science, technology changes, the ability to see things changes. You don't want to dig up everything now, when in actual fact it's actually better to leave stuff in the ground. But there are cases where with development you can't leave that in the ground. So let's say that a pipeline is going to go through. It cannot avoid the HRV 4A site, so the known archaeological site. The company has to hire a consulting archaeological firm that goes out then and conducts a study. And let's say during that study, wow, it becomes really apparent that it's like a super important site. We may bump that up to a 3 at that point, and we will work with the developer in terms of what needs to happen. It's very, to be honest, it's quite rare that that happens. There are times, and I mean, I think one of the examples that's most recent is the oil sands area. There's a site up there that is now an HRV1. It's a designated site, and it's called Quarry of the Ancestors. And that is an incredible, probably one of the most important boreal forest sites in the world exists up in the oil sands area. And so that actual parcel of land was removed from active mining, and it sits as a little island in the middle of this active oil sands area of sort of pristine boreal forest that encompasses this incredible site where people would come from all over to make stone tools, a quarry, right? So they'd make stone tools there. So that's an example, but that is an incredibly rare occurrence, okay? So I hope that answers your question. We have a system, an online system that allows you either as, so if the municipality is going to develop something, this is what you need to know. And I have an email, I'm sure I've sent it to an awful lot of you out there, that's really long, but it explains all that, and I'm quite happy to send it out to anybody else too if you want something in writing on it. So as a municipality, let's say you want to do a development, you would apply, just like everybody else, to our online system. It's very straightforward. There's nothing really difficult about it. And I have those links and everything else that I can send out. And you know, what happens then is you apply, we take a look at it, we decide at that point whether the project can just go ahead, so you get approval, or if there's studies that may be needed, and if so, what kind of studies and to what extent, okay? So that's all done through our online system. So that's what that main page of that system looks like for those of you who have not ever used it before. It's very straightforward. So what's the process? How do we make those decisions? So I think this is what we're coming down to. So the application is submitted. We love it when you can provide shapefiles. I know that's not always possible for some of your organizations. We will work with you on that. We're really happy to talk you through anything that you need, survey plans. So we work off of known project footprints, right? So we're not going to issue an approval for sort of just a concept. Now, we'll talk about area structure plans in a minute because that's a concept rather than a known project footprint for the most part. But for the known project, so you've got, let's say you want to put in a road. Put it in, you give us a shapefile, survey plan, whatever it takes. What happens is my group, the land use planners, take a look at that and say, oh, okay, we need to send this to the Archaeological Survey and the Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology. We may decide that it doesn't need to go to any of the other places. Send it off. Those areas, the experts, the archaeologists and the paleontologists in this case, would look at that development and make a determination about whether there is a potential or not. They then, this is all done in our OPAC system. It then comes back to us as planners, right? So at that point then, we as planners take a look at it and say, okay, here's one of 3 outcomes that's going to happen here. An approval is issued. We go, nobody has a concern with this project. Please go ahead. Great. There's an approval with requirements, so there might be conditions such as maybe we would like you to have a paleontologist on site to monitor a specific portion of that development as it goes along just in case, or post-impact assessments. There might be some of those things, or there might be a historic resources impact assessment required. So what that means is that the applicant, in this case a municipality or whoever, would have to wait before proceeding with the development. You'd have to wait until you've got the study in and the approval issued. Okay? So let's say there was an HRIA. Let's say this road, and we want an HRIA for archaeology. You hire an archaeological consulting firm. They go out, they do the study, they submit it back to us. We take a look at it. At that point, we may say, all right, everything is good. You have approval. Or there may be additional studies if, let's say, there's a spectacular site there and we really want to take a closer look. We want to make sure, because that road is going to completely obliterate the site. You have to understand that historic resources are non-renewable resources. Once they're gone, and there's no getting it back. So rather than lose those, we would then do maybe a staged mitigation program where we say, okay, you need to do 10 square meters of excavation, this, that, and the other thing. So there's a process that goes with this. So how do we determine this? Well, here's just a basic thing. So certain types of projects are going to obviously have a low impact, some are going to have higher impact. So let's use the example of a trail versus a gravel pit. So you're going to have a trail, which is pretty low impact for the most part, and then we put that, we take that look as well as with the listing, and we say, okay, what is the impact? What is the actual ground disturbance that's going to happen? And what is the potential in that area for those historic resources? So you can see we kind of do it based on knowledge that we have of that area, and we have people that are experts in all areas of the province for this. Oh, so here's, okay, so here we have penalties under the Act, although I'm not aware of anyone actually having been, at least, I think maybe once since 1973 was there an actual fine issued. We try and really work hard with people not to be in this place. Mostly if there is an infringement of the Act, it is completely unconscious. There's not a deliberate thing, and so we understand that. And so we're really, and this is one of the opportunities that I'm really pleased to have to get the word out. We need for people to understand so that it sort of works really well. So this is the penalties section. So let's just, okay, so what does this mean in terms of the land use framework? All right, so I think, Rachel talked about the rough outcomes. I won't dwell on any of that, but what you're going to see, and I use the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan as the example as well, under the strategic direction, you're going to see strengthening communities, and I've got the page numbers written on here if you want to take a look at it. Municipal decisions in the region should aim to protect, enhance, and promote the historic and cultural integrity of an area, and under building sustainable communities, foster the preservation of historic resources through responsible land use management. So those are things that you're going to see on this next page. What you're going to get is there's actually, in the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, there is an entire section based on historic resources, and that's on pages 110 to 111 for those of you who have a copy of the plan and you want to take a little closer look at it. But the municipalities are expected to. So that's an interesting word, expected, for me. But what it does is it says, we want to work cooperatively, really, with you. It's not required to. Sorry, I'm just taking a look because there's a couple of questions here, and I'll get to those in just a second. But municipalities are expected to identify significant historic resources to foster their preservation and enhancement, work towards the designation of municipal historic resources. That's what Larry's going to talk about at the next session. Formulate agreements with the Ministry for Development referrals to assist in the identification and protection of historic resources. Again, that's part of the regulatory, what we're talking about here today, right? And so one of the things, and I said I would sort of refer to it later, is area structure plans is a classic example. So we've got a lot of municipalities are submitting area structure plans to us. We don't provide an approval, generally speaking, for those. What we do is we help municipalities to identify, hey, here's where historic resources are. Should you decide to either develop yourselves or allow development by an outside party in this particular area, we'll help you by identifying where we feel that there would be impact assessments required, or where maybe we would look to you to say, hey, maybe we could look at that as an environmental preserve because that would hold that area off. It works really well, and so far I think it's worked quite well with the ASPs to do that. That's one of the things that we're trying to do. When it says formulate agreements with the Ministry for Development referrals, yeah, I would like very much to be able to sit down with each individual authorizing body or municipality and say, how are we going to do this? And one of the things that we've talked about is what I see in some of your development authorizations is you say that if you issue a development approval to an outside body, I see things that say, you must conform to the Water Act and to Environmental Protection Act and these sorts of things. We would love dearly to see a clause in there that in each of those agreements that says, and you must adhere to any requirements under the Historical Resources Act. Love to come out. One of our big pushes coming up this coming year will be to be going out to individual municipalities, meeting with you on an individual basis, talking to you about the things that we see in your areas and the kinds of things that you can expect, and to work with you on those sorts of initiatives. So that's what when it says formulated agreements. They're informal agreements, nothing formal, just talking to you about ways that we can work together. So that's, again, opportunity. So this is what I'm showing. I realized afterwards that this picture is probably a bad picture to use, because if you actually look in the right-hand side, the bottom right, that guy's pointing a gun at all the others. Now, that's not what we want to do. We're not pointing a gun at your head. I don't know what's going on there. That's from Fort Victoria, which is, you know, or yeah, just I don't know what year this picture is taken, but it's kind of fun. So I put the picture in, but I don't mean it to look like that. So how can Alberta Culture and Tourism and municipalities work more closely to ensure that sort of approach to protecting historic resources? So really today, that's what I want to really talk about. I really want to, you know, discuss with you through, you know, the chat box here about ways that you think that we can work together, answer your questions about what what questions you may have in terms of how do we do our process. So Kathy N. Oh, that's not a question. That's a comment, looks like.
Participants have the ability to ask questions of each other. So it sounds like we've got some strategizing between people on the call, which is great. So Anna, just as we transition into the questions and discussions, and I encourage any of you who have questions to type them in now. As I said, there can be a little bit of a delay. But it sounds like if there are municipalities that have kind of questions about historic resources in their area and what they can do, that a really good place to start would be to perhaps reach out, engage with you, and have you look at their area structure plans. That's maybe, if you haven't, for municipality where historic resources haven't maybe been on their radar, that might be a good entry point in and a good place to start the discussion.
I think so, absolutely. I think that the area structure plans are a really great place because it's a proactive approach to do it that way. It sort of identifies up front, maybe not specifics in terms of, you know, especially with regard to HRV5s, the high potential areas, but it does give an opportunity for us to engage with you to say, okay, here's what we know, here's the known sites, here's what, you know, here's some options that we think that we can work with you in terms of either, like I say, municipalities developing on their own, or if they're, you know, it's part of a broader kind of, you know, private company kind of allowing that to go ahead. So I think that that's really good. One of the things that we do have as well is we have a subdivision bulletin. Now, I'm going to be really upfront about this. We wrote the subdivision bulletin to talk about how we think that subdivisions should go on and when to apply and that kind of thing. Here's the thing. We aren't the sort of planners that you are. We're all historians, archaeologists, paleontologists, that kind of thing. We're not using the right language when we speak in that subdivision bulletin. I think it's actually caused a little bit of confusion because subdivisions for planners in the municipal world is separate from development, I think, is what I understand. What we really are talking about when you see our subdivision bulletin, we talk about subdivision development. We're actually talking about footprints on the ground. We talk about area structure plans as well, and it's on our website, and I'm happy to send it at any point in time to anyone who wants it. That talks about, you know, when you should apply in OPAC, and you know, when you can just kind of let that go, what the size of the developments are, that kind of thing. So we are very open to having a conversation about that bulletin with planners because we want this to be something that works for all of you, and we need to use your language, your terminology. It's for us, we have to learn so much about every single industry that's out there. You know, What we need to learn how, SAGD operations work. We need to know how transportation works. We need to know how campgrounds are designed. We need to know all of these things, and so it's hard for us because we have to be a lot of things. We count on people who are authorities and experts in their area. So in your case, it would be the municipal planners to say, hey, you know what, that doesn't make any sense to me because this is not the way our business talks. This is not the terminology we use. We want to use your terminology, talk to us, tell us, hey, that makes no sense at all. Please help, change it for this. We're super open to that and really encourage any input you've got. Okay, so City of Lethbridge. There's municipal and public joint engagement and public conversations in rural communities. I'm not sure, Tara, what is that?
I wonder if it's about what is the role of engagement in kind of and the public in these historic resources. I know when we were talking before the call, you mentioned that sometimes the public reaches out to you about concerns that they have, some of which are maybe valid, some of which are not. But maybe you could talk about the role of the public in this, because of course, municipalities are looking for more effective ways to engage the public in land use planning, whether it's through charrettes or other things. But so Tara just added the need for and the role of the public in these processes.
And role. Okay. Sure, I understand. And the thing that I was talking to Rachel about before we all logged on here was the concept, for instance, of gravel pits. Now, all of you, I'm sure, are quite aware of the controversy those can cause in a lot of communities. People, they tend to be quite a touch point for a lot of people. And so what ends up happening in a lot of cases, I was saying to Rachel, is that we'll get the public individuals from the public phoning. They'll phone me, and they'll say there's this gravel pit, and it'll become clear fairly quickly that they want the gravel pit stopped. Especially if they're near it. That I can understand. It's very NIMBY, but it's what happens. It's human nature not to want something like that, let's say, beside you. And so individuals look at the historical resources and go to themselves. They think, oh good, this is a way to stop this from going ahead. I don't want this. And so maybe there's historic resources there. It's not what the Act is intended for, and I have to really be careful with them to say the Act is not to stop development. That's not what we do. However, it becomes a little more of an awkward conversation if, for example, they call up and I have to say, I have no idea what you're talking about in terms of a development. It can be and has been misconstrued by those individuals that the municipality and the developer, for instance, are colluding and not following the Act, whereas in actual fact that's not the case at all. There may have just been no knowledge of what it is that we require. So we're working really hard to make sure that that's a very transparent process, so that when I get those calls from the angry individual landowner who doesn't want the gravel pit beside them, I can say, yes, we reviewed this, and from a historical resources perspective, there is no concerns. So in terms of the public engagement, I think it would be really awesome to talk, to go out, have these sorts of, and I'm quite happy if you want us ever to come to your organization or to your community and have an open conversation about what is being done to protect historic resources. Again, we would sort of say, okay, here's what we do in terms of regulatory, and here's what we can do as the voluntary tools that are available that allow municipalities to protect those kinds of heritage resources that the community feels are of value. And I think that would be a super useful conversation. We're very much open to that kind of thing. So please call us anytime and we'll come down. In terms of what the City of Lethbridge is asking here, our HRI is required for all area structure plans, or just when areas with historic resource value are known. All area structure plans should come through OPAC. It's pretty straightforward. You can give me a call and we can chat about it and what it means. But we do ask that all area structure plans come through us. It helps you. Obviously, it adds value to your area structure plan. You've got a broader depth of understanding of what's on your landscape and how you can manage for those various things, if there's anything. I mean, we may just say, listen, in this particular area structure plan, we don't see anything. area redevelopment plans. Oh goodness, you know, that would be a little bit of a different thing, and I would imagine that you know, we don't have a specific, we don't mention those in our bulletin, but I would say that if you're proposing a redevelopment plan, maybe give me a call. Let's chat about that, whether we think that that particular one needs to come through OPAC or not. There could be there could be a few cases where it would be okay, you know, for us. In terms of subdivisions, now I know a lot of you, a lot of the municipalities send through, as you know, the generic sort of, you have a whole list of government bodies that you send referrals. You're going to do subdivisions. You send it through what we call our historical LUP, and we want to tighten that up too, so that it sort of saves you guys from having to think, why did those guys not respond to us, right? Because generally speaking, when it comes to a subdivision on paper, you're changing the land use from this to this. Generally speaking, that's not by definition under our Act an impact. The impact only comes when there's development. So it's really less about the paper exercise of changing the subdivision categorization than it is about what is ultimately the development. So deciding when development happens, what should go on. And so I would really, that's very much a broader conversation. I would love dearly to have a conversation with people out there about how we could work on that, because for us, we don't know your business and we need to know yours. I mean, we know it peripherally. I would love to have an in-depth conversation, maybe even do it through the AUMA, kind of just a small working group, to say, here's what we want to do, here's what I need to know, here's what you can offer us. Love to do that if anyone was interested.
Great, and maybe we can have a bit of a follow-up to this. So what I hear you saying is that the actual impact assessment might not be required in all cases, but that it's great to send the area structural plan through that program to your office for a general look, but it may be a very simple, thanks for sharing, but there's nothing here. So for municipalities not to get afraid that just because they sent that in, it won't mean that they'll be part of a protracted process.
Yeah, and just so you know as well, just on that before we get to the next question, absolutely. And we would not, I mean, generally speaking, right, so if you have an area structure plan that's just a municipality trying to figure out what they want to, like what kind of zoning they want in their lands, it's not the municipality that would have to do the HRI. Ultimately, like I say, it's when it comes down to development, and that would be part of the developer's responsibility. So if you have, you know, a company that wants to build a subdivision, and it's identified as subdivision wants to build. So I think of subdivisions as a bunch of houses in a place for industrial or whatever. But if they want to develop for industrial purposes, let's say, within, and so it falls within your area structure plan, then that gives you the opportunity to say, hey, you know what, you want to develop here, but you're going to have to go to Alberta Culture and Tourism because they've identified such and such a thing. You may or may not, depending on their development, have to do more work, right? So in terms of the area structure plan, no, you would not be a situation where we would say to the municipality on the area structure plan, because there's no known footprint. Okay, so let's see, there's another one. If land that was HRV5 and may have moved to HRV is privately held, what is the lowest level classified as development? Oh, I see, okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough one for us too. Those really aren't those small scale. And our subdivision development bulletin will tell you it's really, I think we're at 10 hectares is what we, or is it 5? I'm sorry, because we tossed it around so many times. I think it's 5 hectares. So anything under that, if there is an HRV4, and it seems like it's going to be these sorts of, like a pad for a camper, a trail versus a road. Roads certainly, trails somewhat. It's always better to be safe than sorry. It doesn't cost anything to apply to us to say, okay, what needs to go on. But if you're talking about someone who's got a farm, for instance, and just wants to, put another house next to the current one, we're not looking at that kind of level of development. unless there was something, let's say it was an HRV3, then we'd probably say, oh, can you give us a call? Mostly though, a lot of land in this province, particularly when you're talking about private land and that kind of thing, has already been disturbed, and subsequently a lot of times you can have that whatever would have been there before is probably already gone. On the other hand, you can take a look at, Lacombe there, you had that great hadrosaur that came out from a subdivision development that nobody had any idea about, and kudos to you guys for bringing it forward. And it was that's a good news operation right there, because there's certain types of development, certain types of developments are bad for some types of historic resources, but they can be really good for others. So you've got a subdivision which could destroy archaeological sites, but like in the case of Leduc there, was it Leduc or Leduc, I think? Leduc hadrosaur. They did a subdivision, and lo and behold, there's a great big dinosaur. And so it's the same thing for a lot of things, like a lot for paleontology. Development's actually what exposes those things rather than destroys them. So it's a good news thing if you can give us a call, right? So I hope that's I feel like I'm rambling.
There's a lot to learn, and that's a good segue. That seeing no more questions right now, that we can really pick up and continue with this conversation at our next webinar. Living History, the municipal role in bringing historic resources to life. So Larry Pearson, awesome. Director of Historic Places Stewardship for the Historic Resources Management Branch of Alberta Culture and Tourism, will make a presentation on the opportunities and tools available to municipalities to preserve and protect locally significant historic resources. Joining Larry will be Jennifer Kirchner, planner with the City of Lacombe, to share lessons learned by the city through implementing their award-winning heritage preservation program. And to register for this webinar, just follow the link that I'm about to put in the text box, and I'll send this out as well afterwards. And further webinars are being planned in our land use webinar series on environmental frameworks and conservation tools being implemented under the framework. And so stay tuned to our digest for that. And if you do have any last questions, do feel free to type them into the chat box. We can send them out with a link to the recording, and I'll also be sending out, if it's okay, a PDF of the presentation, because there's lots of good references in that.
Yes. Sorry, and I can also send you the bulletin, and you can send that out with the...
For sure, that's great. And just before we leave, I just wanted to let you know, make sure that you're all aware of our economic development survey, especially because historic resources and economic development can really go hand in hand, whether it's development impacting historic resources or historic resources really contributing to economic development activities. So to inform AUMA's ongoing work on building capacity for local economic development, we're seeking input from our members on resources that you would find most helpful. Specifically, we're seeking your feedback on the following: best practices in local economic development, municipal success stories, barriers and challenges in fostering local economic development, and awareness and use of AUMA's existing economic development resources. And so just click on the link I posted in the chat box to fill out that survey. And we also, I know there's a lot of rural municipalities on the call, and we welcome your input on this as well, since this tool will be available for, or whatever we develop coming out of this will really be available for all municipalities. So thanks so much for participating on the call. Hope you found, on the webinar. Hope you found this really valuable, and we look forward to having you participate in the next webinar on November 25th.
Thank you very much, everyone.